Is the second installment of the Lyceum Roundtable. I'm joined by Keith Preston and Swithun Dobson to discuss the problems with liberalism. So, Keith, why don't you open up with a sketch of the history, the ideological history of liberalism?
Well, liberalism has its roots in the philosophy that came out of the Enlightenment. I guess you could say the first modern liberal was someone like John Locke. And the idea behind liberalism initially had to do with, number one, the rights of property. That is, if you look at John Locke and his phrase, the right of life, liberty, and property, against the usurpation, say, of the political authorities. And parallel to that, parallel to the economic idea of property, was the idea of the market and commercial society, which is associated with Adam Smith and some of those thinkers. That is the idea that the market economy and trade and all of these kinds of things produce their own benefits. And also there's the political implication of this, which is the idea of citizen rights, the idea that citizens have rights against the political authorities, whether it's freedom of the press or free speech or something like that. It's all of the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, out of the work of thinkers like John Locke on a more conservative end, and maybe the French philosophes and people like that on a more radical end. You see liberalism being enshrined in the American Constitution. Everyone has the inalienable right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the things that are in the Bill of Rights, the right to a trial by jury, and those kinds of things. And you see this also in the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Natural Rights of Man. So there's this idea of political rights is really the core aspect of liberalism, along with the growth of the commercial market economy. In a wider sense, you see a greater emphasis on the use of science and reason and things like that as a means of solving social problems. There's a certain emphasis on human perfectibility that runs through certain aspects of classical liberalism. And so that's really the foundation of modern civilization. I mean, modern, what we call modernity, that is most all Western countries and other countries that have a similar social system today are liberal countries. They may have differences in terms of policies and things like that, but all of them are basically liberal countries. The only major country in the world today that's not a liberal country is probably China. Most other major powers are liberal to some degree. I guess you could say there's some doubts about Russia. Maybe that's semi-liberal, but certainly everything that we think of as the West now is dominated by liberalism, classical, historical liberalism. Parallel to that is the idea of the democratic government or government by representatives or constitutional rule or something like that. So this is the foundation of modern classical liberalism. Now, in the 19th and 20th century, you start to see the rise of what could be called reform liberalism or social liberalism, and this is associated with thinkers like, I guess a prototype of this would be someone like John Stuart Mill in England. But then in the 20th century, you see someone like, say, John Rawls, in the post-war period. Although going back a little bit further than that, there's progressivism, what we call progressivism, which is the idea that, well, it's not enough for the government to simply maintain order and uphold property rights and things like that. You also need the government to regulate in the name of social fairness, for example, labor standards or civil rights for minority groups or protecting the environment or something like that. The idea that government plays this role in distributive justice or whatever one wants to call it. That's really what Americans today certainly think of as liberalism. Europeans think of liberalism more in the traditional classical sense, but Americans, when they think about liberalism, they're really thinking about reform liberalism or social liberalism. And then, of course, there's neoliberalism, and then this is the point of view that emerged in the late 20th century. It was widely considered to be a counterattack against the influence of things like Keynesian economics and Marxism in the 20th century, or socialism broadly defined. And it's the idea of, well, markets are good, trade is good, international commerce is good, austerity is good, low taxes are good, all of these kinds of things that we associate with conservatism today, conservative economic policies today. So that's really the historic trajectory of liberalism. It starts with classical liberalism, John Locke, Adam Smith, the French radicals, Thomas Jefferson, the American Revolution, and then it extends through reform liberalism, the welfare state and social democracy, which are really just variations of social liberalism, and then neoliberalism, or what gets passed off as conservatism today.
Okay, thanks, Keith. One element that seems to be consistent through all these forms of liberalism is the idea of human rights. Now, they might disagree over what constitutes human rights. There's the debate between negative and positive rights going back to the Cold War. But generally, rights usually associated, but not always, with self-ownership, as a sort of riffing off John Locke in that regard. Now, one of the main problems that I see here with this is that, and I might have some pushback from Swithun after I say this, but rights have never been demonstrated. Nobody has ever given a rational first principles demonstration that rights exist. Locke came closest, probably. Now, in modern day times, the sort of reform liberals and left liberals don't really even attempt at all to give a justification for rights. Libertarians do, objectivists do, but I guys, as people who watch my channel are familiar with, I've made quite a few attacks on the non-aggression principle. The idea that rights are a derivative of self-ownership is, again, it's never been systematically demonstrated, I think, to my satisfaction, or even the satisfaction of skeptics. And if you can't demonstrate that rights exist, then at best they're just a useful convention. But then why not throw them out for some other convention? The other thing that is a problem is with rights. It's sort of egocentric in the sense that it's about what I get, what I deserve, what I want. Whereas in prior societies, the fundamental organization was based on duties and obligations. It might be a caste system where you were born in this caste, so you have to do this. It might be that some philosophy or organized religion told you your relationship to the world, and then you had to then act that way. So to contrast, say, maybe an illiberal thinker would be Kant. I mean, I know Kant's famous for the democratic peace theory, but his whole idea is that duty and obligations are the most important portion of a social organization. Now, he's coming from Prussia, Königsberg, so it's not entirely a surprise that he would take that position. But it's difficult to see how a society can cohere together when everybody is in it for maximizing their own extraction from the public good. So, for example, John F. Kennedy said, don't ask what your government can do for you, but what you can do for your government. Regardless of what we think about Kennedy or the U.S. government, he's making an important point. The point is that if everybody views the government as a public stock to just extract resources from, then it ceases to be an effective government at all. And so then, to sort of cap off this discussion of rights, we then have the problem of how do you get them? How do you lose them? So, for example, it seems that if rights are not given at conception, it seems to be utterly arbitrary when you gain them and lose them, because, okay, you gain rights 18. Why? And do you lose rights if you get Alzheimer's? I mean, obviously, old people can become vegetative. They can go to vegetative states. And so if a child doesn't have rights, or a fetus doesn't have rights because it lacks some rational faculties, well, there are old people that lack those faculties. People in comas lack those faculties. Do they lose rights-bearing properties? It's never really been clearly delineated where you get rights. And do you always have them? Can you lose them? And what do you have to do to keep them? So, for example, in the ancient world, Greece and Rome, rights were politically granted privileges that was the result of service, primarily in the army. So the Athenians and the Romans would reward citizens for their service. Now, you don't have to do anything to be a citizen. You're just born in the country. In fact, The whole world should be a citizen of the United States, according to some people. So there's nothing you have to do to maintain citizenship status. So to have access to these rights, because what ends up happening is rights are basically saying that you are owed something that other people produce. And if you're not putting your time in to produce something, well, then eventually everybody's just going to take stuff out of it. So what I would say then is rights are founded on sort of a shoddy intellectual foundation. They haven't been systematically demonstrated. There's a problem of how you get them and how you keep them. Can you lose them? That's a fuzzy area that's never really been nailed down. And then also the idea of obligations. What do you have to do to get rights, to maintain rights-bearing status? And since all of this stuff is so opaque and poorly defined, it leads to all sorts of moral hazards. And I think that that's one of the main problems with liberalism is this conception of rights. So I'll toss the ball to you, Swithun. What are some of your thoughts?
Well, probably the attempt at the most sort of rigorous and deductive defense of sort of liberal rights is probably Hans Hopper's argumentational ethics, which, Todd, I believe you debated Kinsella on in the past, which, let's suppose it works on the grounds that it gives. I think the problem with liberalism, which I think you've highlighted to some extent, Todd, is that rights are sort of tried to be derived in some sort of theoretical vacuum. And I see one of the main problems of liberalism as such is it divorces a general conception of flourishing, which is related to sort of individual ethics or morality as such, and tries to immediately go to the political without building up, what is a general conception of a good life and the sort of obligations, the conditions in which individuals and families would flourish. And I think that's one of the main issues foundationally with liberalism. You've mentioned sort of positive and negative rights, but in most cases, it's, even if you have positive rights, it's so that you are in a position whereby you have sufficient resources so that you can just exercise your will to whatever end you deem fit, rather than having an overall conception of, well, what would be a good end for a human to aim for. So I think that's one of the foundational problems with liberalism as such. It doesn't follow from that, of course, that you need the government to tell everybody what to do. So in that sense, political liberalism with constraints on state power, etc., even though the state is, I would say, inherently bad, but as far as it goes, it's a step in the right direction, as it were. But the problem, as I say, with rights, etc., is it has no overall conception of a human good. That's the way I would attack that. So yeah, and sort of gaining and losing rights. I suppose the best defense of that, if you say that you're human, and so the defense typically is rationality of a certain description. The best argument I've heard to sort of defend always having rights from conception of being human is that humans are rational. It's just that in certain circumstances, their functioning of their rationality is frustrated due to ill health or immaturity. So it doesn't follow that they aren't rational. It's just that, so in the same way, it doesn't follow that humans don't have two legs because one person doesn't happen to have any, but rather that the general directedness of human existence is being frustrated in that sense that they don't actually have the two legs which their human nature would give them. And so in the same way, if you have Alzheimer's, for example, you are human and therefore have rights in that sense, but you can't exercise it because of an impairment. So I think that's a rough and ready defense of sort of rights from cradle to grave and avoiding problems which you might associate most typically with Peter Singer. That's what I'm thinking of. Mr. Infanticide and was it certain apes are morally more worthwhile at the age of 6 months? And
something like that, yeah.
And parents could kill their child under the age of 6 months because he didn't have a memory of himself, and that's what Singer takes to be the definition of being human. But in most cases, it'd be wrong because it would upset the parents. If the parents are fine, then it's okay. I believe that's a correct interpretation of Singer. So those are my broad views on sort of liberalism at base and the problem of the rights. Not that rights in itself are a problem. It's just that they try to start too late. If they started earlier on a more broad conception of human good and flourishing, then I think the rights have a better foundation.
Mm-hmm. So, Keith, do you have anything to add to this discussion on rights?
Well, I think you're right, Todd, in the sense that prior to the rise of liberalism in the 18th century, the idea of rights was conceived of more in a corporate sense, in the sense that, well, particular classes, say, had rights on the basis of being that class, or particular communities had rights on the basis of being that community. So what we're really talking about is the kind of status differentials that you see in traditional societies. A good example, an extreme example, but a good example is the Hindu caste system in India. There you had certain rights based on belonging to a certain caste. And of course, if you didn't belong to a caste, if you're a subcaste person, then you didn't have any rights at all. But typically, though, rights were conceived of as some sort of group privilege based on some sort of status differential. That's what rights meant in traditional societies. What was unique about the Enlightenment conception of rights or liberalism was the idea that rights are universal. I think that that's really the main innovation or addition, or I guess a more traditional conservative would say it was a degeneration. But whatever you think about this idea, the innovation of classical liberalism was this idea of universal rights. The idea, well, it says that in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, all people all men are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And so this kind of universality, I think, is what differentiates liberalism from older forms of older theories of rights. And along with universality is this idea of equality, that there's an implicit egalitarianism in that, in the sense that, well, rights are universal, so that means that rights really ought to mean the same thing in America as they do in Italy, and as they do in Russia, and as they do in China or whatever. Now, of course, one of the classic rebuttals to that was the one that Joseph de Maistre argued. He says, well, in all of my travels, I don't remember the exact quote, but in all of my travels, I've seen Poles and Frenchmen and Englishmen and Italians, whatever, but I've never seen man, because he was criticizing the idea of the natural rights of man. He's like, who is this man? That's just an abstraction. Of course, the modern liberal comeback to that is, yeah, but we're all human. This is really one of the definitive aspects, and probably is the definitive aspect of the left today, in the sense, or what is considered to be the left today, in the sense that, well, there's absolutely no difference between people on the basis of any of these traditional status differentials, whether it's social class or race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, disability, a long list of categories, and they keep adding on new categories. The idea that all of these things are essentially interchangeable. And what really matters is universal human rights. If you are associated with the left today, or that particular sector of the left, you'll hear that constantly. Universal human rights and democracy and freedom and social justice for everyone. It's all about being as hyper inclusive as possible. But I think that has its roots in the Enlightenment idea of rights. Now, the problem that I see with rights defined in that way, in when it comes to universality is, what about cultures and peoples, individuals and groups that have no interest in any of this? The interesting thing about the idea of universal rights, universal human rights, or universal natural rights, or whatever, is that they originated from particular cultural groups in particular circumstances. They're originated in the English liberal tradition. They originate in the French Enlightenment and basically Northern European ideas. And you can argue they grew out of older, say, Catholic ideas about natural law. And maybe if you want to, turn it back far enough, you could go back to Aristotle or somebody like that. But this particular idea of rights is historically, it's a fairly unique concept, and it's one it's actually fairly parochial in terms of its cultural origins. Now, that's not to say you can't find things that are somewhat similar in some other places, or that no other culture can ever adopt these ideas. But there is that interesting paradox of, we say, okay, everybody has universal rights, everybody is equal, but what about people who don't believe in universal rights? What about people who don't care about universal equality? And I think that's the real dilemma that modern liberalism has. They say, okay, universal human equality is our goal, universal human rights, but we have all these other folks who don't believe in any of that. So what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. Now, you, Swithun, brought up a good point that I want to riff off of, is the idea of the lack of a substantive conception of the good. Because this kind of gets back to the interview that I had with Jim Golb. And it's liberalism says that, okay, to the extent there is a conception of the human good, is it's maximizing preferences. So that's in part why capitalism is always catering to new desires, new fads, because it's more preferences. That's freedom. You have more preferences, so you can do more stuff. And what the problem becomes is preferences contradict each other. So which set of preferences are going to be the set of preferences that dominate in a given society? Since there's no substantive view of the good, you can't have this sort of essentially de facto moral anarchy where there are preferences that are favored over others. And so then what is the deciding factor? Well, this kind of gets back to After Virtue with Alistair McIntyre. He said that modern political society was a civil war without guns. And that's because, we don't have a substantive view of the good. And what that just leads to is a kind of might makes right, whereas the might is represented in number of votes. So if you get the majority of votes, then you get to ram through whatever you want, even if, 49% of the population doesn't agree with it, close to half. So, and that's because it doesn't really have within itself the means to equitably arbitrate between competing preferences. And what it really ends up boiling down to, and I think Jim is right on this, is that the preferences that are tolerated are those preferences which are suitable within a broader commercial, industrial, service sector society. So why is drugs, they're always harping on drugs, but not casual sex? Well, because if you're stoned, you can't go to work. You might lose an arm in a factory, but casual sex, while it certainly has, it can reduce workplace efficiency because people are, angry at each other or whatever, or distracted, generally doesn't have as much negative consequences to the bottom line as, say, drugs. And so we see that those things that are tolerated, those preferences that are tolerated, are those preferences that fit most neatly into this, globalist commercial system. And so another thing, this is something that Keith brought up, the idea that liberalism as an abstraction ignores historic contingencies. See, this is actually a very important point, because modern liberalism and its continental and Anglo variety are both coming from specific historical contexts. 16th century Holland, 18th century France, 17th century England. And if those cultural and political institutions are not present in other countries, then it's not going to work. Case in point, the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. where we thought that, well, these are universal principles, universal humanity. We can just, build a liberal society out of nothing. And of course, it didn't work that way. And this gets into the point that in his reflections on the French Revolution, Edmund Burke, he says that left, liberal, whatever you want to call it, political theory is always a priori. And of course, Mises mocked that as the bloodless abstractions. If you have all these bloodless abstractions, not real people, well, then of course you see how it breaks down then, because if you don't see Iraqis and Afghanis as real people with historical, cultural, political institutions and memories, then you think you can just impose anything you want on them. They're just blank slates, but they're not. And so it's going to fail when you do that. What you would have to do is build those institutions in those countries, which would take decades or centuries to build, as it did in England and France. So I think those are two really good points you guys brought up. And then the last point I want to mention is liberalism assumes people are fungible. Now, fungible is an economic term, and I'm using the Investopedia definition. Fungibles are items that are interchangeable because they are identical to each other for practical purposes. Now, the idea that humans are identical to one another for practical purposes, it's just so obviously false. It's hard to understand how that's the case. In anybody's lived experience, that there are people that are really slow and others that are really fast. And in a race, they're not fungible. In a race, the fast people are going to win. If you want to get into a fight, the stronger, more, wily types are going to be able to win in a fight, and the weaker, more type won't. So the point is, they're not fungible in any meaningful sense, and you can't treat them as such. I mean, case in point, women in the military. You're right. The military has two separate physical standards for men and women, and increasingly police forces do as well. Well, okay, that's because they're not fungible for practical purposes. And so you have these outcomes that are expected because people are fungible. That's the statement. And if there's any inequality in outcomes, it's the result of prejudice, because we're all the same. We're all fungible. But you see, we're not fungible. And so what happens is you have this insane push to do all this because they can't admit that there's just certain objective factors in the world that are going to lead to unequal outcomes. And as such, that's just a part of the fixture of nature. So what are some of your thoughts on these points, Swithun?
Preferences and who wins. I think that's exactly correct. Whichever preferences are consistent with the current ruling class are the ones which will always be favoured. If it's the right of multinational corporation to do as they please over a small holding who have had use rights over a particular area for a long time, we know who's going to win. So yeah, in liberalism, although you could argue that historically that was always the case anyway. I mean, you could always make the case that when in any society, whoever is the ones with most power and influence will win out. So it might not, in practice, be a particular problem of liberalism, although it certainly is a problem on some of a theoretical basis. With respect to fungibility, I don't think liberalism necessarily requires you to treat everyone as fundamentally the same. So, for example, if you look at Rothbard, is a very strong inegalitarian, at least with respect to outcome, and also with male and female differences. I remember reading him on egalitarianism, a revolt against nature, in which he is not too delicate with the feminists, to put it mildly. So I think that's certainly true of social liberal, a more modern sort of social liberalism. But of liberalism as such, as sort of like the autonomous individual, yes, it's true that they are the same insofar as they're an autonomous individual, but I don't think it necessarily follows that that is all humans are, even from a liberal perspective. But you are right, and Keith mentioned, I can't remember who said it, about trying to bring democracy to the Middle East. There is, in the sort of modern conception of liberalism, if I'm going to be kind, and naivety, or I'll just treat it as propaganda for the Western voting blocks. But yes, we are trying to bring all these good stuff that we have to all these foreign people that are backward, when in fact what we're trying to do is to establish resource control or currency control or something like that, which is more likely in most cases. So there is that. With respect to, just as we haven't mentioned democracy as such so far, there is actually that is in a sense of fungibility in principle, that each individual voter is somehow equal, which is the most absurd view that you could possibly imagine, that somehow someone, just because he's turned 18, can vote, has knowledge of what is going to be an effective social system in which people can flourish, is just bizarre. I mean, most people's knowledge of sort of sociology, economics is non-existent, if not negative in most cases. It doesn't follow from that, of course, that they can't run their own affairs reasonably well if left to their own devices. But somehow to decide that, oh yes, the best way to reduce conflict and a smooth running of an orderly society is to treat everybody, because they're over the age of 18 or whatever age it is in other countries, that they should all have an equal right to vote, even though they're not necessarily property holders or have any sort of direct stake in, as it were, the capital value of the country. I think a lot of these liberals probably don't have any children, or probably don't have very many, because children are stupid. It's surprised that most children don't die every day. I mean, mine try to kill themselves on a regular basis. And it's a surprise sometimes that they end up alive. And this is probably true of most children. So somehow to think that everybody's the same and they get to a certain age and they can somehow magic and then they can decide is just absurd.
Exactly. So, Keith, do you have anything you want to add to this? Oh, you're muted, Keith.
There's a couple of things that we've only briefly touched on, but I think are really critical to having any kind of critique of modern liberal democracy as it's practiced in modern societies. We talked a little bit about the idea of natural rights and all of that. I tend to actually have a negative view of the idea of natural rights, in the sense that I just don't think they exist. I mean, I think that that's what Plato called a noble lie, or what Georges Sorel called a political myth. That's an idea that was developed at a particular time period by particular people in particular circumstances as an expression of their own interests, as they perceived them at the time. That was very much a product of the rising commercial societies that existed in early modernity. And it was very much a product of the Enlightenment philosophy that emerged during that time period, and also the classes that were rising. I think the Marxists are probably correct when they say that, well, liberalism was just the ideology of the early bourgeoisie. It really was. It reflects the perceived class interest of the rising bourgeois class or commercial classes that emerged during the early modern period. And that's why I think that classical liberalism as defined during that time has since been eclipsed by modern liberalism, in the sense that you have whole new waves of groups that come along and gain power and influence in society and say, well, no, we have a different idea of what rights are. That is, we believe in the kind of rights that benefit us. So we're going to redefine the concept of liberalism, or we're going to redefine the concept of rights to make it mean what we want it to mean. So you have a whole different idea of what liberalism is, or what rights are. So once again, it's the same problem that you find in pre-modern societies, in the sense that it's ultimately the same thing. People are just defining rights, as well as, the flip side of rights is duties and obligations, as was said earlier. Like, for example, it's generally thought that in a modern liberal democracy, you have the right of free speech, or you have the right to vote, or you have the right to freedom of worship, or you have the right to a trial by jury when you go to court, if you're accused of a crime. But then parallel to that, well, you have the obligation to pay taxes, or you, like I think it was one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices, Oliver Wendell Holmes, that said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization. That's one of his quotes. So you have the duty to pay taxes, supposedly. You have the duty to serve in the military, at least during time of war or whatever. You have the duty to, or some people say voting is a duty. In some countries, democratic countries, it's mandatory that you vote. So it's the same idea as you find in older societies. Rights are based on status, and then parallel to rights, the flip side of that is we've also got certain obligations or certain duties. So the problem really hasn't been evaded at all. It's really the same problem. It's always been there since time immemorial. That is, you have people that are defining their rights as well as their obligations based on how they see their own needs and their own particular circumstances and their own particular time period. In modern democratic societies, you see all kinds of rights movements that have emerged in recent decades. You see, civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, disability rights, the rights of the mentally ill, the rights of animal rights, all kinds of things. All of these things are simply statements of interest. That is, people saying, well, our needs and interests are not being met. Therefore, or what we want isn't being met. Therefore, we're going to redefine this concept of rights to make it mean what benefits us. And that happens all the time. That's why the whole battle over what constitutes rights keeps changing, and it keeps expanding to mean new things. So the problem that existed in antiquity is still there when it comes to the question of rights. Now, the idea of democracy is interesting, because modern democratic societies are not just democracies of any kind. They're liberal democracies. There's the idea of blending liberalism with democracy. That is, you have a liberal political culture, rooted in the ideas of Locke and Voltaire and Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and people like that. But then parallel to that, to liberalism, you have democracy, the idea of, well, the people should rule, vox populi, the general will, the consent of the governed, all these phrases that we all learned in, basic political science classes. The thing is that those are also contradictory ideas. Liberalism and democracy in that sense are contradictory. Of course, Hans Hermann Hoppe nowadays is one of the leading critics of the idea of trying to blend liberalism and democracy. He says, look, you can't have both. You can't have liberalism and democracy. Now, from his perspective, he wants to, amplify the classical liberalism aspect and jettison the democracy aspect. You also have people from the other end of the spectrum who say, liberalism is this old-fashioned ideology of, white male capitalist or whatever. So what we really need is mass democracy and popular participation and all of these kinds of things. But I think really one of the most interesting critics of liberal democracy was Carl Schmitt, who living in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, which was a new liberal democracy that was extremely dysfunctional. He actually had the opportunity to observe some of the problems with liberal democracy up close, and he said, well, look, The problem here is that liberalism is just not working the way it's supposed to. It's supposed to be based on reasoned debate among contending interests, and then the truth wins out as a through this kind of process of Socratic process. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. It's just collections of interests struggling for power based on what they want or what they think they are entitled to or what they need. And when it comes to democracy, why do you have to have liberalism to have democracy? Carl Schmitt said that the basis of democracy is acclamation, not voting per se. He said, couldn't the state, for example, be democratic if most people approve of it? All right, for example, if it could be Bolshevism, it could be fascism, it could be theocracy, but as long as the state receives acclamation from the people, most people approve of it, or at least tacitly support it, or don't actively resist it. Why can't that be considered democratic as well? And there's something to that. There have been we've talked about countries where they've tried to introduce liberal democratic institutions and failed. One interesting example was Algeria. In 1992, they had an election in Algeria, and Islamic parties were running in the election saying, okay, if we win, we're going to forget about this democracy thing and set up an Islamic state. If we win, that will be the last election, because then we're going to have an Islamic state. Well, they won because that's what the people wanted. That was the voice of the people. The people spoke and they said, we don't care about this Western liberal democracy thing. We want an Islamic state. That's what reflects our values and our culture. Then, of course, the military stepped in and nullified the election. So it was basically the military who was the voice of liberalism in this particular situation. So that I think illustrates the conflict between liberalism and democracy, in the sense that you can have plenty of liberalism and no democracy, or you can have plenty of democracy and no liberalism, and the two are always in tension with one another. Another issue with democracy is the one that some of the more radical classical liberals, like say John Stuart Mill, pointed out, and also some of the early anarchists like Proudhon and others, Bakunin, and that was, what about tyranny of the majority? What is so sacred about 51%? Why shouldn't why should 51% be the basis of social order? Why not the individual? Shouldn't every individual be able to do what they want to do, irrespective of what the majority says? Or you could take it in the other direction towards elitism and say, instead of just raw majority, 51%, why not the smartest? Why not the top 10% in terms of IQ differential? Or why not the dominant ethnic group or the dominant social class or something like that? So that's another issue with democracy, is its arbitrariness, the whole idea of a 51% majority being an arbitrary concept, particularly when the 51% is not conducive to upholding liberal institutions at all.
Exactly. One sort of talking about how the system can be hijacked, as you were mentioning in Algeria. There's a YouTuber who goes by the name Monday Blue, and he was talking about how in the United States, people who are millennial and Gen X, if they're asked, are you proud to be an American? Most don't. And it's not just the liberals, because America's this white, racist, sexist patriarchy. Even conservatives will say that, of that generation. And it's because, if you're a conservative white man, then, the system is out to get you. And so what we end up seeing here is that we have these competing preferences, which have not really won, or the two parties are sort of like in tension. The Democrats represent one set of preferences. The Republicans represent another set of preferences. And it's sort of an uneasy truce in the sense that one hasn't, St. Valentine's Day massacred the other side. But what ends up happening is the country splits apart. And eventually, if it continues this way, what's going to happen is all these competing preferences are just going to lead to the complete disillusionment of the social order. The social order and the state are just going to dissolve because nobody has anything in it. And then the people that will dissolve it will be the ones that Keith was talking about, that take advantage of the democratic process to end it. I mean, the most famous example, of course, would be Hitler. he used a democratic process to end democracy. And we also see that it's interesting how democracy has changed in meaning. So classically, democracy meant active participation in the political process. So, like in Athens, the adult male population was required to vote on the issues, and then those that forwarded the bills were selected by lot from the adult male population, free male population of Athens. So these were actively engaged in their own governments. Whereas today in democracy, it really just means, showing up a couple times out of the year to vote, which it's like it's a really watered down definition. I mean, nobody's really actively engaged in it except, the politicians and, activists. Everybody else is just kind of along for the ride. So it's not entirely clear, how that's democratic in the original conception of democracy, because as I said, it's the active participation in it. And also this, but see, this is part of the problem though, right? In Athens, there was a substantive view of the good that everybody, if they wanted to be a good Athenian, had to live up to. And so that included participating in making the laws of the country. Whereas in the United States, because we don't have a substantive view of the good, what it really amounts to, democracy is just people showing up a couple times in the year to vote on, state, local, and federal elections. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Swithun?
Talking about the changing nature of democracy reminds me of George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, which I can't remember exactly what year it was written in. But the most interesting part of it is where he says, basically, fascism is, means a system that you like. In most cases, democracy, even though you say, oh, it's the majority, most people, when you push them hard on it, though, as Keith said, well, they don't really want to advocate tyranny of the majority, so they'll have to modify it slightly. So with the whole competing conceptions of democracy, is interesting. I don't know how closely you followed the whole Brexit situation and the current political situation in England. We've had lots of debates recently over whether the prorogation of Parliament was democratic or whether it was undemocratic. Basically, prorogation is meaning that the Parliament doesn't sit, and the Prime Minister, using the powers invested in him from the Crown, can basically stop Parliament from sitting. This was done basically so that the MPs couldn't try to block leaving the European Union. And so people said, oh no, this was anti-democratic because Parliament is sovereign and the parliamentarians should do what they want. Other people were saying, well, we had the referendum, the MPs are trying to stop the Brexit actually taking place in any meaningful sense, and so therefore the prorogation was democratic. So you have a system which is very similar, very tightly knit, but then people are going, well, no, what the Prime Minister is doing is democratic, and what the Parliament is trying to do is undemocratic, and vice versa. So the different approaches of what democracy actually means. Is it following a referendum result, or is it parliamentary? Is it sort of referenda, or is it representative democracy which sort of wins out? Which is true democracy? Which is a somewhat tedious debate, and I haven't really bothered to watch it because it's really dull. But that's what's been taking place. Because, as Keith mentions, of the contradictions of liberalism and democracy. I mean, in particular, if we talk about neoliberalism, which, for want of a better definition, is the current economic paradigm, it's obvious that the British establishment want to maintain the current economic paradigm because ever since the referendum results, they've done as much as they possibly can to prevent leaving the European Union in any meaningful sense, because it is a huge shake-up to what would be the neoliberal project and a general global project as such. And so they've done as much as they possibly can to try to stop this happening, even so far as blocking having a general election. I don't know if you followed this recently. They've now said that they are not going to vote for a general election, the Labour Party, even though they've said for like 2 years we should have an election, because they're always saying that because they think they'll win. But now they're trying to put nearly going through maybe Monday to force the Prime Minister to go to the European Union to ask for an extension, which is a huge change of convention, because normally international treaties are considered the prerogative of the executive. So they're trying to force a Prime Minister against his will to go to the European Union to do this. And they will not have an election before the European Council date because of a weird act that was in at the moment. It's called the Fixed Term Parliament Act. In England, basically, you can't go more than 5 years, but previously the Prime Minister could just have an election whenever he wanted. There wasn't a fixed term in the way in which, say, the US presidential election is every 4 years. So all the ill types are trying to elect in defending democracy. This is the weird and wonderful world of English politics. So,
do you have anything to add, Keith?
Well, we have a similar argument that goes on in U.S. politics with this thing called the Electoral College. The Electoral College, of course, survives from the 18th century when the presidency was not elected by popular vote. I mean, literally not by popular vote. The president was initially selected by electors that were appointed by the individual states, as was the Senate. The Senate was originally appointed by the state legislatures. And it wasn't until later that the president was, more or less elected by popular vote, and then the Senate elected by popular vote. But now we've had in recent decades a couple of elections in which the president was elected with a majority of electoral votes, but a minority of the popular vote. Trump was one, and then George W. Bush back in 2000 was another. And so, of course, people from the left in both instances are saying, well, this proves that the Electoral College is out of date because it's thwarted the will of the people. The other side got the majority of the popular vote, but because of this weird electoral system we have that was put together in the 18th century, the party that gets the minority votes actually got the offices. Now, of course, the other side of that, and I actually tend to agree with this, is that having something like the Electoral College actually has the effect of mitigating against vox populi, against democracy as 51%ism or mob rule or whatever. Because one of the effects of the Electoral College is that it does allow for representation by people who otherwise would be shut out of the electoral system altogether, mostly sparsely populated rural areas. But also you have population groups in certain areas that have to be taken more seriously than you would if you just had a raw majority. For example, if you have to get if the goal is to get a majority of electoral votes, and you have all these different states with electoral votes, then all of a sudden, the Cuban minority in Florida becomes a lot more important, or the gay minority in California becomes more important, or the Mormons in Utah become more important. So that, I think, in some ways, I had a professor in college, a political science professor, who was very much a liberal. He was a Democrat. Voted for the Democratic Party, and he went to Preston and all of that. So he was a liberal in the conventional sense, but he was actually in favor of the Electoral College for the reason that I'm outlining. He says it actually has a framework for giving representation to people that otherwise would be unimportant if you cared only about raw 51%. Now, this guy was a black guy as well, and I suspect, he didn't say this, but I suspect he was concerned about the impact that raw majoritarianism would have on ethnic minorities. Again, this was in the 90s. It was over 20 years ago. But I do think that there's something to be said for having these kinds of constraints on majoritarianism. One thing that I think is good about the way the U.S. system works, at least in theory, is that political power is supposed to be spread out between the different branches of government and the different layers of government. And then you have these internal mechanisms, like say the Electoral College or whatever, that prevent either, at least theoretically prevent, any one office of government obtaining absolute power or monopoly of power. And it also prevents mob rule at the same time. Now, there are downsides to that as well. I think our system was set up to be a plutocracy, for example, of the mercantile class, and all of that. I think financial oligarchs and all of that have pretty much taken it over and probably always did run the show ultimately. But the concept of 51%ism, though, I don't really see that as a solution to anything. I mean, so you want to have the 51% majority that wants to put say a 20% minority in concentration camps or something like that. I mean, why can't they be able to do that? I mean, if that's majority rule, why not? It's and then, of course, if you present this idea to a modern liberal, they say, "Oh, no, because with democracy, we have human rights and we have equal rights and all that." And to which I always say, why? You can have 51%ism without all that. That's that represents the influence of something else when you start veering off into those categories. What was said earlier too about people who think of themselves as being proud to be an American, the point Todd raised. One thing that I've noticed in talking to college students is that among that particular generation, and specifically, you see almost zero patriotism, American-style patriotism. In fact, I've even, just as an experiment, I've asked my own students at different groups of students, where I would say, well, how many of you think of yourself as a patriotic American? And usually nobody's hand goes up. And these are mixed, in some circumstances, they've been mixed audiences, mixed groups in terms of ethnic backgrounds and class backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. It's not just one particular segment. It's not just far left-leaning people or people from social groups that have been disadvantaged historically. I mean, people from privileged backgrounds, people from the dominant cultural backgrounds, people from other backgrounds. It just seems to be a non-issue. And I saw a CNN poll a couple of years ago that showed Americans knew almost nothing about the Constitution. Like something like a third of Americans couldn't name one branch of government. So it's this whole idea of civic engagement obviously is a joke in that kind of context. I mean, it's I've had students, college students, who don't know what country the United States originally separated from, don't know what year the Declaration of Independence was signed, have no idea what the 4th of July is, what that even commemorates. That's just a day when nobody goes to work. It's and these are university students. These are supposedly people who are better educated, and I see adults like that. I come across people who are older who think like that. So what goes on in a lot of our modern liberal democratic societies is obviously not democracy in that sense. It's obviously something else. I think really it's neoliberalism, and I think really neoliberalism is just a euphemism for a type of corporate plutocracy, and with the elected officials, like Parliament or Congress or whatever, simply being the managerial class. Their job is to manage the system that the people at the very top of the pyramid are profiting from. That gets to why Brexit is so unpopular with Parliament. Because Parliament could care less about what the will of the English people is. They care about what what's in the interest of the people who they're working for. They're just employees. They're like managers in a corporation. It's what the board of directors wants that matters, not what the customers or the rank and file employees want. So in that sense, we could say democracy doesn't work, and liberalism really. I mean, we have societies that are liberal in the sense that there's lots of diversity, there's lots of there's a wide range of options. I mean, you can certainly have plenty of different styles of restaurants to go to, and different styles of clothes and entertainment, and movies and stuff like that. So we have diversity. But there's also a great deal of ideological and conformity. I mean, there's a great deal of conformity that's enforced. I'm seeing that now in the U.S. elections that are coming up next year. We have the primaries going on, and we have these candidates that are being rolled out as potential candidates. And it seems to me to be fairly obvious what's going on, that the elites favor some candidates over other, that they're trying to stack the deck so that their preferred candidates turn out to be the winners, that the ones whose ideas they find most objectionable, they're trying to shut those out completely to the degree they can, without totally upsetting the system, the whole constitutional balance. So again, that gets back to this issue of, do we really have democracy or liberalism? And we have sort of what's supposed to be a hybrid of the two, but in some ways we could say we don't really have either one.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time now, so I think it's time for closing statements. So we'll start with you, Swithun.
With the electoral college system, I would generally defend that for similar basis that Keith did, to prevent tyranny of the majority. The interesting thing is, with respect to Brexit at present, is that if there was an election via the like a similar electoral college system when it comes to Parliament, it's not exactly the same. Well, at least no, it's either senatorships and things. Is that if there was an election, most of the MPs who are trying to basically keep the UK, for all intents and purposes, in the EU, would be booted out, probably. It depends how we go, but it will probably be a moderate majority. So you've got the bizarre situation for a genuine sort of hard Brexit situation. So you have the odd situation where people are going, oh, yeah, the Parliament's been, Johnson's being undemocratic by proroguing Parliament. We've got to support the MPs. But really, what they're really doing is just defending their own preference interest, which is the current economic order. They aren't principled. So it's odd at the moment that really sort of like a quasi-electoral college system is being defended by the left, for want of a better phrase, the neoliberal elements, rather than sort of the nationalist populist types.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Were you done?
Oh yeah, and just in general, yes, liberalism is unstable when you have a great diversity of general views. So when it comes to England voted massively to leave, with the exception primarily of London. London is a complete outlier, and say Scotland as well. And the future really of liberal states like this, unless they're going to have a strongman leader, is probably breaking up, because the fervour of Romania in London is huge relative to most of the rest of England. So if liberalism is to survive in any sense, it's going to have to get smaller. Otherwise, you're going to like it to have some sort of strongman to keep it all together.
Okay, Keith.
Yeah, I think that breakups are probably the future as well, because we see the same thing in the United States. We see that the red team and the blue team and all of that tend to view each other as almost existential enemies at this point. They see each other as the equivalent of enemy nations. In fact, I even mentioned this to someone who was a very diehard partisan in some of this stuff, and they said, yeah, that's how I view it. Yeah, the other side is like an enemy nation. And I've heard people on both sides of the spectrum say that, the left, right, and that's before you even get into the subgroupings. You have a lot of parts of the United States that really do view the other parts as a separate country, a separate nation, or something like that. But I lean, of course, I'm an anarchist, as everyone knows, so I lean towards the idea that you can't really have a functional state over an indefinite period of time when you have all kinds of people from divergent backgrounds forced under one political roof, and expecting everyone to get along. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. On one hand, I think something like that can work in a society where everybody agrees about basic values. But when people don't agree about basic values, then you're going to have some real problems. So the trend in modern societies now is to push as much diversity as possible on one hand, but at the same time say, well, but everybody's got to be under the same system, and everybody's got to embrace these others, this general set of values as well. So it's contradictory. It's like the idea of, well, everybody's got to be conform ideologically, but we got to do it in a diverse way. We want diversity and conformity or whatever. And so that doesn't really bode well, I think, for the future of modern systems. I think that the trend in the future, perhaps a distant future, but the trend is going to be more towards localized political systems that are probably going to be more internally homogenous in certain ways, but where there's a greater shared consensus on values.
All right. Well, thank you so much for showing up today, guys. This is Todd Lewis of the President for Life podcast signing off.